Chinese government forces are brutally kicking millions of people off their land in unprecedented numbers. A report by Amnesty International finds that forced evictions are on the rise. The victims, people caught up in deals between local governments and property developers. Just how much of a problem is this for China's leaders, and can this lead to widespread civil unrest? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome. I'm Jane Dutton. Thrown off their land to make way for business parks. Amnesty International says that there is a significant rise in forced evictions in China. According to the report, a rapid construction boost is to blame, with the number of evictions going up in the last 3 years. People are forced from their homes to make way for business ventures. Local authorities reportedly seize land in what's known as suspicious deals with property developers. Officials rely on the profits from land sales to make up for huge budget shortfalls. Amnesty also found that violence is used against some people during the eviction process. Of 40 cases examined, 9 resulted in the deaths of those resisting eviction. Well, forced evictions in urban and rural areas are widespread in the country, but one of the most notable examples in recent years was the run-up to the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, when many neighbourhoods in the capital were torn down to make way for new developments. The Centre on Housing Rights and Evictions estimates that 1.5 million people in and around Beijing were forced from their homes. And according to Human Rights Watch, authorities shut down over 50 unregistered schools for migrant workers. This left tens of thousands of children without access to education. To date, legal action by evictees has been, well, to put it mildly, ineffective. Courts were ordered to stop hearing cases from residents, and lawyers were restricted from representing them. As a result, many found it impossible to find legal representation, let alone have their cases heard. So, can the Chinese government stop these forced evictions? To discuss this, I'm joined by guests in Hong Kong, Nicola Duckworth, Senior Director of Research at Amnesty International; in London, Martin McCauley, an International Affairs Specialist; and by Skype from Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, Independent Chinese Analyst, Professor at the Metropolitan University in Hong Kong's former representative in Europe. Thank you all three of you for joining us. Let's start off with you, Ms. Duckworth. Tell us more about your findings and what really stood out for you.
I think what stood out for us, because, as you mentioned, forced evictions are not a new thing in China. China's growth has been phenomenal, and growth is often accompanied by the need to move some people from their houses. Not all evictions are an abuse or illegal, but what we've seen in China is many of them accompanied by such things as lack of consultation, lack of compensation as well, that make them actually forced evictions in the sense of being illegal. They seem to us, it's very difficult to get statistics, but to be on the rise. We know that the Chinese authorities, the central authorities, also recognise that the issue of forced evictions is the biggest single cause of popular discontent in China today. So against that backdrop, we looked at the issue of forced evictions, and I think 2 things stood out for us in terms of the research that we did over a 2-year period up until January 2012. The first thing was what appeared to be a rise in the number of violent forced evictions. So that's forced evictions accompanied by some sort of violence or coercion. That in some cases was, for example, communities being pressured to leave their homes or sign away the rights to their land use by, for example, the local authorities or property developers cutting off essential supplies like water or electricity. Or other cases that people talk to us about where, again, the authorities or property developers had hired thugs wielding iron, steel bars or knives to threaten or beat the residents. So, as you said, 40 cases we looked at all involved some form of violence or coercion, and in 9 of the cases, in 9 instances, people died as a result.
Yeah, I mean, your report makes some pretty gruesome and difficult reading, finding out what happens to people, as you mentioned, the levels of violence. How easy or hard was it to get this information? Are people frightened to talk out?
I think it's not easy for a number of people trying to investigate these issues. Firstly, yes, a number of people were very worried about their security and about reprisals if they were identified by us in the report. So we needed to be very careful that they couldn't be identified. But they did want to talk to people about what was happening. Our representatives of housing rights activists, lawyers, journalists and so on, because they feel, many of those that we talk to, that actually they have very little avenues of redress through the court system. They feel that the only thing that will make a difference in many cases is if they can get the case known to a wider audience beyond the local authorities that they think are responsible for this. And that, to them, seems to be one of the only ways of trying to achieve some change in the situation. So fearing reprisals, but very much wanting their story to get out.
I'm sure. I mean, Mr. Leung, why do you think the government is resorting to this type of behaviour? We've seen it for many years, as Ms. Duckworth was saying, but why on such an increasing level?
Well, I think that we have got to draw a line between the local authorities and Beijing. I think what has happened throughout all these years is that the central government was saying to this local government that the center cannot afford to pump up, to give the local authorities all the money for the infrastructural developments that are driving the world's and the history's largest urbanization drive. As China's building 221 new cities, up to 2025. So there was a lot of money involved. And what the central government has said to us is that they would have the authorities to develop the land, but the central government would not have all the money to be able to finance all these projects. So what has happened is that the local authorities are taking matters into their own hands.
But do you think it's easy for the central government to step back and say, listen, it's got nothing to do with us. What's happening over there is really down to the local governments?
Well, I think that because of the rising level of unrest, and this is threatening the whole stability of the Communist Party. And that's why the central government is very, very much concerned with this, especially in the lead up to the new leadership transition. And I think that we're seeing something on the cards already. For example, through those high-profile incidents, the one in Wukan village, for example, and the one in Xifan. And in Wukan, we were seeing the top party secretary of the entire province going down into the lowest possible level of the administration, which is the village level, and trying to overturn a project which was decided by the State Council. This is very, very unusual, suggesting that this party secretary, who was a rising star, and in fact, rumors has it that he's a very, very high chance of being included in the standing committee of the Politburo in the coming leadership lineup. For such a person to, sort of take that action suggests that there is some sort of a understanding with the top leadership in Beijing. Secondly, the recent example in Xifan, again, there was a project decided at the highest possible level, and then the local authorities had to back down very, very quickly. Now, this is something we haven't seen before. And this mixed with the recent Bosilide affair, I think the leadership in Beijing is coming to realize that the whole system is under some existential threat if they don't deal with this problem. And the other a very clear indication is the 468-page World Bank report. Now, there is nothing wrong, nothing special about World Bank reports, but this particular one is special in the sense that the Development Research Center of the State Council at the highest level has lent its name to it, included in the recommendations in the report, is to deal with the relationship between the local authorities and the central government, and the problem of the migrant workers you mentioned earlier in your introduction. So all these are major threats to the party, and I think the party has come to realize that they have to deal with this problem very, very vigorously.
Okay, you've raised certain points there, and let me put them to Mr. McCauley. I mean, do you agree with the guest there that the government is facing some kind of existential threat here, and this is possibly what justifies local government's action in their eyes?
Well, I would separate central and local government here. One has to remember that 51% of the population of China is now urbanized. They live in cities. And as the previous speaker said, new cities are being built all the time. There's 16 million more cars on China's road every year. So therefore more highways, more roads have to be built and so on. So therefore you need an enormous amount of infrastructure built. And unfortunately the amount of arable land is almost fixed. So therefore more and more of that land will be taken. So therefore you have a conflict over property. Now China is a socialist market economy.
So are you saying that China is in some sort of compromised position, that there are some sort of concerns about food security?
Yes. The old leadership, the leadership which will give way next month to the new people, have said that the existing political and social model has to be reformed, has to be changed. The Prime Minister, Wen Jiabo, has always been talking about economic reform. Nothing's really happened. He realized that there are problems now. As the country gets richer, as the middle class expands and so on, there are major problems. It's only been a market economy, a socialist market economy for 20 years. And one of the major problems, of course, is our property rights. And property rights require decades to evolve. These peasants don't really have any piece of paper. In England and Wales, the land registry registers your property, and then you can take it to a court and defend yourself. But in China, that's only beginning. There's no central land registry. So therefore, there's always a conflict over the land. The local authority will say, we're taking this, and the peasants say, no, 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 you can't do that. You should point out that Chinese law states that the peasants should be compensated in a fair way. And part of the problem is that they don't get fair compensation. So you have a local authority which is in debt, and it takes out loans because each local authority in many ways is run like a business, and it has to make a profit, and the centre expects it to do that. And the only way to do that in the short term is, in fact, to sell land, because all land is owned by the state. So anybody who has the land, it's only a lease. So therefore, they lease this land, and the state says, we're going to take this land. And
okay, Ms. Duckworth, sorry, if I could just put that to Ms. Duckworth. I mean, clearly China needs land. It's got to keep up with the pace of development and people leaving their farms. What sort of conversations do you have with the higher powers about how to create some sort of balance here where everybody is appeased?
Yeah, certainly we have restricted a dialogue with the higher powers in China, but yes, definitely economic growth is not a bad thing. We're not against that. But what we are saying, and based on our research and indeed that of others, this is a really serious problem, that the economic growth is actually resulting in a group of people, often the most marginalised and with the least voice and the least able to get redress. Those are the people that are bearing the costs of economic growth, but not benefiting from any of the prosperity. Growth and development don't have to result in forced evictions. There are safeguards that can be put in place. Yes, they require adequate compensation for people, so in that sense they cost more than not giving people any compensation at all, but that just needs to be factored in. Forced evictions don't have to be a consequence of economic development, and indeed shouldn't be. I mean, there are international obligations against this which China itself has voluntarily signed up to. It just needs to abide by them.
Okay, if they have signed up, if they've ratified these agreements, is there any way that you can hold them accountable?
Well, certainly one of the agreements that China signed up to in 2001 was the Economic Covenant, International Covenant, on economic, social and cultural rights, which is a covenant of the United Nations. And that has a regular meeting of experts in a body to review regularly the progress of a state in actually implementing what they've signed up to. So in that way, there are a number of instances through the intergovernmental system where we would seek to expect China to explain what it's doing in front of these experts in such cases, and the experts can question them about their behaviour. But that's at quite a top level, at an intergovernmental level, and really what needs to be done sometimes is occasions, for example, like the EU-China dialogue. I mean, we'll be pressing very much through our offices with the European Union that they also use the opportunities of that dialogue, and indeed states' bilateral relations, to push these issues with China, because they are happening on such a large scale. And they are illegal in terms of what China's doing in forced evictions. So it does represent quite an enormous scale of abuses.
Mr. McCauley, are you surprised that the US and possibly the EU haven't jumped on this sooner? I mean, the US in particular likes to take every opportunity it can to have a jibe at China. We're seeing this kind of behaviour not happening only within China, but in other countries where China is bringing a lot of development, Africa, for example.
Yes, one should remember that in China it's ruled by law. It's not the rule of law. What the previous speaker was talking about was the rule of law. The rule of law does not pertain in China, and the Communist Party is above the law. The case of Bo Xilai will show that, and the fallout from all that, and so on. So, therefore, in the end, the lawyers and the judges have been told that their policy, their decisions are to strengthen the role of the Communist Party of China. That means, because they're afraid of instability, because if they've, you can see the possibility if the judges at the local level find in favour of these peasants who are protesting and so on, then that undermines local authority and control. What Beijing has done is basically say it's impossible for the central government to rule China on its own. It has delegated that authority, a lot of authority, to the local level, the local authorities, and the local authorities compete with one another. They compete for resources and they compete for labour and so on. And if you look at Bo Xilai in Chongqing, he built a lot of social housing and he looked after migrant workers. That's one of the reasons why he was so popular. And there's something like 200 million migrant
Bo Xilai
workers.
was one of the rulers. I mean, many people thought that there was a possibility that he could take over in the future, and he's facing criminal charges, sex charges, murder charges. Do you think that this is a sign that the leadership realises that change is possibly afoot, that they need to do something now before there is some type of massive civil unrest?
Bo Xilai was potentially very, very dangerous because he was going back to Mao. He was going back to collectivism. He was going back to egalitarianism. And he was challenging the centre. And therefore, had he, almost certainly he would have been elected to the Standing Committee. He would have been one of the 5 or 7, we don't know how many, top comrades in China. He would have been very powerful had this scandal not erupted. Now, if the economy then went into free fall, because at present it's slowing down, the world economy is slow, so therefore the demand for Chinese imports has slowed and so on. So therefore the Chinese economy is slowing, and if you then slow the economy, more people lose their jobs, there's more social protests and so on, and somebody like Bo Xilai could become a populist. And therefore they've decided to deal with him severely, put a Politburo member on trial and accuse him of corruption, a breach of power and sexual impropriety. That in fact, if you like, undermines the authority of the Communist Party, but it's a warning to all Communist Party cadres: you're not above the law, you're not above Beijing, and we will intervene. But of course the situation now is very, very sensitive, because we're going to have a changeover, but something like 70% of the top party and government leaders will change next month. They will need time to bed in, to establish themselves and so on.
Okay, let me put that to Mr. Leung. I mean, excuse me jumping in here, but this change that we are expecting, I should imagine that these forced evictions will be a real issue, one of the main priorities, one of the hot topics.
Well, not directly, because there are lots of unrests all across the country, although not united. They are all isolated cases. But I think that the issues are the abuse of power and corruption, and especially at the local level, are threatening the stability of the Communist Party. And then secondly, certain scheming of individuals like Bo Xilai would not be allowed to rock the boat, as it were. And even various factions, as it were, are coming to a consensus very quickly, and that's why Bo Xilai is now being dealt with very, very quickly. And I think,
but they also have to come to some kind of consensus what the economic model is, don't they? I mean, you've got these capitalistic aspirations, and you've got looking back to it's a communist rule right now, but when it comes to the land grab, that the state still wants the land. That's a confused policy.
Well, there is no question that China will go back to collectivism. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, even Wen Jiabao, during his swan songs speech at the last Party Congress, was saying that even if he had the single breath left, then China would make sure that China would not go back to the times of the Mao era, as it were, and I think there's no doubt about that. I think the question is that in this rapid development, there are lots of corruptions, lots of abuse of power, and then great inequalities. And I think these matters will be addressed. And also the part of the problem is because of the migrant workers. And I mentioned the 468-page report of the World Bank. And then the reform of the so-called hukou system, which marginalize all these migrant workers, is again flagged up as one of the proposals or recommendations. So
Ms. Duckworth, do you think that this issue is going to get a lot worse if unemployment continues to rise? And we're certainly seeing that happen at the moment.
Yes, I think probably it is something that will be in the mix when you're looking in the round at the difficulties, the tensions between various parts of society. And as I said earlier, it's often the most marginalised who feel that they're the least benefiters from what's happening. If you add into the mix a large number of unemployed people, then that could add to the sort of simmering tensions that we've seen in the research that we did for our report around the issues of people who have been made homeless and dispossessed. Some of them losing their livelihood and therefore adding to this mix of unemployed people.
And as you say, briefly, if you will, they have nowhere to go. They have no one to tell, no one to represent them.
That's very much the feeling of people who talk to us. And if I may just mention, one of the other fairly shocking trends that we found during the research for our report was an increase in the number of people who clearly driven to despair and a protest of last resort had actually set themselves on fire. In that same 2-year period, we documented 41 cases of self-immolation in China linked to the issue of forced evictions. And if you set that against a figure of less than 10 for the whole of the previous decade, then I think that's another indicator of the issues of despair that people feel in not getting a resolution, not having their complaints heard, a feeling that they've got no other way out.
OK, let's leave it at that. Clearly something has to change. Will it change with the next elections? We'll have to wait and see. We'll certainly be bringing that news to you here on Inside Story. Talking to us from Hong Kong, Nicola, Duckworth in London, Martin McCauley, and via Skype in Hong Kong, Andrew Leung. And as always, thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Please send us your feedback. Email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For everyone, I'm Jane Dutton. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.